America confronts a daunting geostrategic landscape. The Axis of Aggressors, consisting of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, are cooperating across multiple domains in unprecedented ways. Putin continues his brutal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. In return for North Korean troops and artillery shells for Putin's war of conquest against Ukrainians, Russian security assistance is flowing in increasing quantities to Pyongyang, potentially eroding the balance of power on the peninsula. The Chinese Communist Party is sprinting to field a military that it hopes can defeat Americans in the Pacific. And the Islamic Republic of Iran has, of course, not relinquished its support for terrorism and its interest in nuclear weapons, even as it murders thousands of Iranians who simply want to be free. Now, with huge numbers of U.S. combat forces assembled in the Middle East, Washington is at risk of being duped again at the bargaining table. Meanwhile, the Trump administration has issued a new national security strategy and national defense strategy, heralding what I believe is one of the most consequential transitions in U.S. national security policy in years. Joining me to discuss all of this is a soldier and scholar who knows a thing or two about strategy, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. As Foreign Policy listeners know, he is the chairman of the Board of Advisors for FDD's Center on Military and Political Power, which I lead. He served as the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs during President Trump's first term. He served also as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 34 years. He's the author of At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, and the award-winning Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. We have much to discuss. I can't think of anyone better than HR with whom to discuss it. I am Bradley Bowman, Senior Director of FDD's Center on Military and Political Power, filling in for host Cliff May. We're so pleased you've decided to join us too here on Foreign Policy. General McMaster, welcome back to Foreign Policy and to FDD World Headquarters. It's been a few months since we've sat down together. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Hey, Brad, great to be with you and FDD. I always learn so much here. I need to come here as much as I can so I can stay on top of the game.
Well, I've learned so much from you throughout the years, and it's great to sit down again. Let me start, if I may, with an assertion, and would love to hear your thoughts on whether you think it's right or wrong. I feel like that we are living through, as Americans right now, potentially one of the most consequential and significant pivots in U.S. national security policy that we've seen in years, if not decades. You're a real historian. I don't even act like one on TV. I want to be careful with such assertions. What do you think? Is that right or wrong, or how would you tweak it?
I think that's right. And I think we're in really facing a crossroads at this point between really if we're going to maintain an engaged sort of approach to the world in terms of an activist foreign policy and as well as forward-positioned military forces that operate as part of alliances to deter conflict and protect our vital interests abroad, or if we're going to go to kind of a spheres of influence approach to the world and kind of cede parts of the world to other powers, and to, for example, to tell Europe, hey, you're on your own and so forth, and I think the reason we're facing that kind of choice at this moment is that many Americans, I think, got tired of our sustained engagements abroad at a time when they were disappointed at home, disappointed by everything from the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the financial crisis, the opioid epidemic, the effects of social media, the pandemic, the list goes on. So many Americans are saying, hey, why don't we focus on our own problems here? What the heck are we doing? But so I think what we need is leadership at this moment leaders who explain to the American people really that these challenges to our security that develop abroad can only be dealt with at an exorbitant cost once they reach our shores. And every American leader, when we're talking about defense commitments, the elements of foreign policy, decisions involving certainly the use of force, but even for diplomatic initiatives, should always begin their discussion with the American public on the so what. What's in it for Americans? Why should they care? Because I think for those of us who do have a generally internationalist approach to foreign policy, have taken that for granted for a long time, and a lot of Americans, feel as if we've been underwriting the security of others so they could conduct social spending, as in Europe. But I think all of that is shifting in a positive direction now. Our allies and partners are really stepping up in terms of defense spending and responsibility sharing for defense. The 5% pledge in Europe, 3.5% of equivalent of GDP going to hard defense capabilities. Japan is doubling its defense budget. And so I think we have an opportunity to renew our commitment based on the other big development, which is this coalescing of an axis of aggressors. This is what FDD has done such a fantastic job demonstrating. And this axis of aggressors at this moment when we may sort of be tending toward disengagement or retrenchment, is in a position of profound weakness. I think they're in a weak position because, Russia thought that we were weak, decadent, and divided in the West. And so they conducted the massive reinvasion of Ukraine. It was supposed to be a week-long war with a big parade. It didn't work out. China, in its race to surpass us, has created tremendous vulnerabilities in its economy. Iran, in lighting the ring of fire around Israel on October 7, 2023, clearly overextended. And Israel, thanks to really them not taking our advice, took advantage of that overextension. It demonstrated the profound weakness of the Iranian regime. So I think we are at a critical crossroads, I would say, and I hope we take the crossroad toward more determined competition with this axis of aggressors, because I do think we're in a period of significant advantage.
As the listeners know well, you served as National Security Advisor to the President in President Trump's first term. You oversaw the development of his national security strategy at the time. Nadia Shadlow did amazing work on that, and she's wonderful. A lot of people, especially those outside the Beltway, when they hear about strategic documents, their eyes roll, and there's some debate among informed people about how consequential these documents are. Yeah. You and your team clearly put a ton of work into the first term's national security strategy. I thought it was excellent. I'm not just saying that because I admire you and you're here. I really think it is. We just had the new one put out in November, and then we had the National Defense Strategy just published in January. Do national security strategies matter? Yeah. If we'll start with that, and then I'll ask you about this current one, and if so, why?
Well, I think they can matter. They should matter. Yeah. And in this case, I think what we are able to do is help the president articulate what he already kind of wanted to do, which is to re-enter arenas of competition that we had vacated at the end of the Cold War, based on the flawed assumption that, hey, ideological competition was over, great power rivalry was a relic of the past. There would be this condominium of nations that would work together in harmony to solve global issues under the auspices of international organizations. Okay, well, that wasn't happening. And so President Trump was a very disruptive, and remains to be a very disruptive president, had the opportunity to be disruptive in a very positive way. And what we did is, and what Dr. Shadlow did with the process, is really tie it to the president's priorities, help give really a clear articulation of his priorities, and to help him think it through himself in the process of preparing the document. I think what was important about the process we put into place is that 80% of the ideas in that document, the president had already presented in various speeches. So we would work into his speeches, for example, our commitment to the transatlantic alliance, but also our expectations in terms of burden sharing, the speeches that he gave in Warsaw, Poland, and in Brussels, Belgium. We articulated his approach to competing economically and financially against Chinese economic aggression in the APEC conference in denying Vietnam. We put into his speech, and these were always his words. He paid a lot of attention to these speeches. His approach toward terrorist organizations and the need to isolate them from ideological and financial, as well as physical and military sources of strength and support. That was, I think, a landmark speech he gave in Riyadh on his first trip abroad. So this really was his strategy. I think it was very well thought out, the way it was organized, in terms of organizing it around vital U.S. interests. Because just by doing that, you're answering the so what questions, right?
Exactly.
So do you want peace through strength? I think so. I mean, we don't want war through weakness, right? So peace through strength. Yeah. Peace is better than war. Yeah. I mean, it's easier to prevent a war and cheaper than have to fight one. The next was securing the homeland and Americans abroad, the homeland security focus. The third was promoting American prosperity, and the fourth was extending American influence in the world. So was anybody against that? I don't think so. You know,
I'm not. I'm certainly not. Count me on that team. When I put the national security strategy from the first term next to the current one, to put it diplomatically, there's some significant differences.
Yeah.
What differences do you see, and what do you like, and what do you not like about the new one?
Well, I like about the new one the emphasis on the Western Hemisphere. I think we neglected it for too long, and I think that in the period between Trump 1 and Trump 2, the pendulum had shifted against us in terms of U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. Remember, you had far left parties win big elections. You had Maduro going really unchallenged and being able to take the support from upstream, from Russia and China and Iran, and distribute support downstream to Cuba, to Nicaragua, getting Daniel Ortega back in power there, and then creating an anti-American kind of sentiment broadly in the region. And so, and that also combined with the narcotics trafficking, the massive organized crime networks that subvert governance, and then go into other verticals like human trafficking. And of course, that exacerbated when President Biden decided not to secure the border. I mean, I still don't get that one. But anyway, so it was moving in a bad direction.
Yeah.
And so you have an opportunity when President Trump comes in to reprioritize. That's good. But what I'm concerned about now is really not calling out countries, authoritarian regimes in particular, who are actively undermining the United States in direct ways. You know, for example, in terms of initiating the largest land war in Europe since World War II and continuing that onslaught against Ukraine. This is Russia, of course, and the broader shadow war against Europe and, hey, the United States.
Yes.
From a cyber attack capability, and especially what I would call cognitive warfare against the United States. China is underwriting that effort in Ukraine, as well as engaging in sustained economic warfare against us in terms of sustained espionage, all sorts of unfair trade and economic practices, which are designed to give them coercive power over our economy. That's a really bad idea.
Yeah.
You know, so I could go on about this, but I really think the strategy is important if it is clear and honest and forthright about the challenges we're facing. I think there was a tendency in this document to go back to the old practice of kind of describing the world as we might like it to be,
Right,
you know?
Right. Like a wish list.
Right, and to maybe not offend anybody, because President Trump, you know, he prefers to get big deals rather than confront.
Yeah.
And so I think what I surmise from reading the document is that the way that we kind of sidestepped, you know, the aggression of adversaries was based on, I think, what is a forlorn hope that we might get a deal, you know, with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping.
Yeah. No, it's I agree with that. And when I look at the national security strategy, there's much to like. But I did note that there seemed to be a consistent reluctance to call our adversaries by name. Yeah. And there's
and the big miss, Brad, is what you've been writing about, which is about the Axis of Aggressors, and which will be the subject of your forthcoming book, which we should all anxiously await.
I didn't pay him to say that, so thank you. No, it's coming, Lord willing, this summer. Me, Mark Montgomery, Elaine Dzinski, looking at all four adversaries, their cooperation across the economic, cyber, technology, and military domains, and most importantly, consistent with FDD's culture, what we do about it. What should we do about it to strengthen ourselves, to strengthen our allies and partners, and weaken and do damage to this axis, which you're right has real frailty in it, but also is in some ways are helping to bolster each other through this cooperation. So kind of a mixed picture. But just like I feel like you said something, begin with the end. My colleagues get tired of me saying that good strategies begin with the end. Start with the interest, and that's the great place to start. But when you have a strategy, my concern about the new national security strategy, and I know I don't want to be someone who's criticizing from the cheap seats here, but as you know well, it's end, ways, and means, and then the very next thing you do, and if you skip this step, maybe you're not doing strategy, is identifying the most likely and most dangerous threats to those interests. Yeah. And if you won't even name your adversary, then that might not bode well for the strategy.
Absolutely, I agree. And again, it goes back to this, describing the world as aspirational, and this is in an aspirational way. And this is really what undercut a lot of the strategies in the 90s and into the 2000s, I think. Really not. Maybe more after 9/11. Of course, it shifted a bit.
Yeah.
That national security strategy was based more on preemption and preventive war if necessary after 9/11 for understandable reasons. But in the 90s, they were aspirational. This was the engagement and enlargement, Bill Clinton kind of strategy, and in the Obama years, that administration, I think, tended to be more performative than formative in foreign policy, and their sort of public diplomacy, their communications operation, was far more active and louder than the actual hard policy making. And I was on the receiving end, as you were. We worked together in Afghanistan of policy documents from the Obama administration about South Asia, for example, about Afghanistan and Pakistan. Then when I read the document, it had nothing to do with Afghanistan and Pakistan. It had everything to do with what people in Washington wanted Afghanistan and Pakistan to be. Right,
exactly.
And so I think they're falling into that trap, and I believe it's a bit of a setup, potentially, for a spheres of influence approach to the world, in which the United States would retrench, allow others to deal with their own security over there. And of course, Russia and China have both demonstrated that they will fill a vacuum, and they'll do so in a way that advances their interests and allows them to rewrite the rules of discourse in their favor. I often say to friends in Asia in particular, who say, hey, don't try to get us to choose between Washington and Beijing. I say, hey, no, it's not a choice between Washington and Beijing. It's a choice between sovereignty and servitude.
Right.
And this is where I think the administration might be missing an opportunity. Our voice is strongest when we're on the side of sovereignty, and we really are on the side of sovereignty.
Yeah.
But some of the actions of the administration, some of the words of the president and tweets of the president, like, hey, maybe we'll take Denmark by force, or like maybe, which of course we wouldn't do, or we take the Panama Canal, or this meme showing Canada and Greenland as a part of the U.S. I mean, it's just gratuitous insults that actually are not just insulting and erode trust as a result, but actually it diminishes our influence in a profound way, because really, if we're on the side of sovereignty, we're on the side of Greenland's and Denmark's sovereignty, we're on the side of Panama's sovereignty, we're on the side of the Philippines' sovereignty, Vietnam, and that's a message that sells.
Yeah, you've used the word, the phrase, spheres of influence a couple times, and I was contemplating asking you about this, and now I can't resist, because just to put a few things on the table, and then you can respond however you want to. I think you and I would agree, and certainly I think General Richardson would agree, who's on our board of advisors, and we've done events and podcasts with here, that for too long Americans have not paid sufficient attention to the Western Hemisphere, and China, Russia, and Iran have been active there, doing things that are contrary to the interests. We should pay more attention to our hemisphere, our neighborhood, if you will, and devote sufficient resources to defend our interests in that. And so when someone hears that, which you just said, and I agree with, and then they hear us saying negative things about spheres of influence, they say, well, what's wrong with defending our spheres of influence? But you use the term retrenchment in the context of spheres of influence, and you said it more eloquently than I have. But I started with the premise that maybe we're at an inflection point, a consequential pivot. And what I was thinking when I said that, in part, was the idea a retreat from an American defense for, dare I say it, the rules-based international order, evidently, which is a four-letter word in some quarters now. We could talk about that, to a spheres of influence. When you do that, as I understand it, that strikes me as some form of retreat. It's some form of, or at least be perceived as some form of retreat from areas, regions, parts of the world where we have vital interest. How would you respond to that?
Okay, so I think that's right. I do think that the backlash against the term rules-based international order is kind of similar to the backlash against anything that has global in front of it. Because a lot of Americans felt that American elites were prioritizing the interests of other citizens over our own interests, right? So, and they had a legitimate point when you look at Europe, accounting for about 19% of the world's GDP. And 50% of the world's social spending, and not investing in defense, but America's covering their defense bills, and then American taxpayers are thereby underwriting their social programs. Okay, they've got a point there.
Yes.
So now you can't use global.
Yeah.
Rules-based international order, I think, is akin to that, because now that phrase has come to mean kind of the soft-headed cosmopolitanism that puts your faith in these international organizations, which, as you know, and FTD's done great work on this, have been subverted by our adversaries and often turned against their purpose.
Yeah.
Like I think the administration's decision to get out of the World Health Organization, I'm kind of for it until they reform, right? So I think these words don't help a lot of times.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about is the importance of an engaged U.S. foreign policy, because our adversaries are very engaged in a sustained campaign of political subversion.
Yes.
They're conducting actually espionage against physical targets, and they're engaged in cognitive warfare. To discredit really representative government, democracy, rule of law completely, to portray their systems as superior, but most important, to sow divisions within our societies, to widen our societies further from each other, erode our common identity, and to reduce our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. So if we're not engaged in that fight, if we're passive, we're at a significant disadvantage, and so President Trump's a competitive person, So I think he's a lot less isolationist, if you want to use that word, less of a retrencher than a lot of the people maybe in his administration. So again, this is why I emphasize making the argument. Why is it important?
Yes.
And I think argument number one that I think Americans understand is, hey, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one.
Yes.
And I tell the story about traveling with President Trump to Asia, with the first trip being in Pearl Harbor, and really using that to bring that home to all of our traveling party. Look at what this war cost us, because we weren't ready. We had four position forces, but they weren't sufficient in the Philippines. The Japanese centripetal offensive kicked us out of the inter-island chain. And you know what? It was pretty damn costly to have to fight your way back in. So it's a heck of a lot cheaper to stay there, to be there, than to have to fight your way in.
As you know well, China and some of these islands that America fought across the Pacific, bled and died to retake. We now have Chinese businessmen and diplomats showing up and buying people off the very places where some Americans were fighting.
Well, yeah, the new vanguard of the Red Army, the Chinese Red Army, is a Chinese national bank official with bags full of cash to spread around.
Exactly.
And but this is to create a servile relationship.
Yes.
This is predatory loans to set debt traps for these countries, to get them again to surrender their sovereignty.
And as General Laura Richardson highlighted in Latin America, a different part of the world, you'd have a country that has legitimate needs to build infrastructure, and they put out tenders, and the only people that show up and bid are Chinese state-owned companies. So there you have General Richardson say, hey, how about some American companies in here to at least compete?
Absolutely. And so we need, and I think we're pushing on an open door there. But also in Africa. But what we also need is those Latin American countries to kind of step up and see the threat. Panama did a fantastic thing recently, their Supreme Court did, in saying, hey, this is a violation of our sovereignty to have Chinese companies running both ends of the Panama Canal. Ecuador did the right thing after a change in government there, after China had built this huge dam, and indebted future generations of Ecuadorians by forcing them in this deal to sell all of their oil exports in perpetuity at a discount. And then there were cracks in the dam from the beginning.
Yeah.
The silt clogged it. The first time they cranked it up, it blew out the entire power grid. Right. So I mean, so there were investigations and prosecutions of the corrupt Ecuadorian officials who allowed that to happen.
Yeah.
So I think we are pushing on an open door. But China didn't really displace the United States and Latin America. We just left.
Yeah.
And part of it was some of these countries just weren't paying the bills. It wasn't profitable.
Yeah.
We don't have state-owned companies that go in and build infrastructure at a loss. So I think there has to be a mutual agreement, and I think there's the right team in place here on the economic side with Secretary Rubio for sure to get some of these long-term agreements in place. I think the U.S. And Latin America have a huge opportunity, and I would say Canada and North America, associated with especially supply chain resilience and a recognition of how unwise it was to allow so much of the world's manufacturing to be concentrated on the southeast coast of China.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need all hands on deck, to invigorate our industrial base, to make our supply chains more resilient. And a huge part of this, as we know now, in the age of AI and with the desire to increase manufacturing, energy security is paramount.
Yeah.
And so the U.S. is now a major energy exporter, and we're developing technologies like small modular reactors, for example, that could have us engaged in long-term efforts to ensure energy security in the region and to do so in a way that's environmentally responsible.
Maybe the trick is, as we focus more on, belatedly, as we should have a long time ago, on the Western Hemisphere, making sure that we don't send signals that we don't care about what happens in Eastern Europe or in the first island chain or in the Middle East, because if we signal that with deference to you, we risk aggression in those places that we could have prevented if we had been clear that, yes, we're focusing more on our hemisphere because this is our hemisphere after all, but we do care about what happens in Latvia and Lithuania, and we will defend it. And if you try us, you'll regret it. But if we send a message of, at least implicitly, of retreat, then I worry about inviting aggression there. And the idea that you keep hitting is that what happens over there matters here, whether it's Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or COVID. We have to be reminded again and again what happens over there matters here. And by simply empowering allies and partners and not insulting them gratuitously, unnecessarily, and working with them, we can deter aggression there at a reasonable cost and do more closer to home.
That absolutely. And a war that develops or expands abroad into Europe or into the Pacific, it's coming. It's coming to the United States right away.
Yeah.
Because the next war, I think, step A, it goes into low Earth orbit and it becomes a space war from the very beginning.
Right.
Because of what you see in Ukraine is the degree to which a range of technologies, especially those in low Earth orbit, but others, like drone capabilities and other, sort of RF collection capabilities in space and terrestrial. They have created a high degree of transparency, lifted the curtain, such that with long-range precision munitions, every military element has to act like it's in visual range of the enemy.
Yeah.
So step A in war is going to be to blind and deceive the enemy.
Yeah.
That's going to involve our satellites. We know that China has already developed a latent capability to attack all of our infrastructure, our communications infrastructure, our transportation, our financial infrastructure. These are the Volt attacks. If any of our listeners, viewers haven't read it, read the DOJ reports on the Volt attacks. And then the other critical thing is on the Ukraine war. Remember we started talking about, wow, gosh, we hope it doesn't escalate. What if it goes nuclear? We wouldn't be talking about that if it had been deterred, right?
Yes.
If Ukraine had just had some of the capabilities that they have now, Russia could never have even thought about having an attack.
Right.
So again, it goes to the president's phrase, Reagan's phrase, peace through strength, right?
Yeah.
And I think what those who argue for retrenchment, disengagement, it's actually they take a profoundly arrogant view of the world because they think that we're the problem overseas. If we this is on the far left and the far right, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of so if we retrench, then we won't have any issues. Well, hey, guess what? Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Ayatollah Khamenei, and Kim Jong-un, they all have aspirations and goals in mind that go far beyond anything that's in relation to us. And Xi Jinping, for example, wants to rewrite the rules of international discourse in his favor, displace the United States, restrict the United States' ability to prosper and to maintain our influence in the world. Russia and Putin is obsessed with restoring Russia to national greatness, and to do so by fracturing the transatlantic relationship, fracturing Europe, essentially because he's not strong enough to go head-to-head, drag everybody else down.
Exactly.
With the war in Ukraine, but also the broader campaign of subversion and espionage. Kim Jong-un, I think he really, really wants to unify the peninsula under the red banner. And we saw on October 7th, 2023, Ayatollah Khamenei really did want to keep his Arab neighbors perpetually weak and enmeshed in conflict so he could extend hegemonic influence in the region, surround Israel, and destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. Yeah. So that's what they want to do. Right. So it's not as if we leave any of them give up those aspirations, right?
And I mentioned the NDS earlier, the National Defense Strategy, and there's a whole lot there I like. I like the emphasis on missile defense.
Industrial base.
Missile defense, on nuclear proliferation, industrial base. I think a lot of what Secretary Hegseth is trying to do.
That speech he gave, I think it was in Texas, was very
and
good.
the Arsenal of Freedom. I like Arsenal of Democracy better, but Arsenal of Freedom, really good. And so I think a really positive momentum there. But you mentioned the cyber elements with a nod to our Center in Cyber and Technology Innovation and Mark Montgomery. We talked about this in our piece on the NDS. There was some good discussion in the NDS, as you would expect, by a Bridge Colby influenced document on the first island chain and a strategy of denial.
Yeah.
Count me in on that.
Right.
But it was almost completely silent on what China is currently doing here at home. And I sat in this very room 2, 3, 4 years ago with 2 Air Force generals, and I was kind of asking naive questions. I said, hey, is the average American, would it be right then to think that that China's busy right now planting things in not only our military, but our commercial infrastructure that they're going to activate in the event of a war to prevent us from flowing forces forward quickly to prevent a fait accompli in Taiwan?
Yeah.
And they said, not only is it safe to assume, it's happening now.
Yeah.
And so the NDS was completely silent on that. So good job on the first island chain, but really kind of silent on the cyber. So I was a little worried about that.
And again, I think part of it is, this, I think, forlorn hope that if you can create the right environment,
Yes.
this is what your Chinese
Yes.
interlocutors would always say. This guy, Yang Jinshi, who was my interlocutor, General, we have to create the right environment, before we have it.
Right.
And I would say, well, hey, you can create the right environment too. Just stop,
two
laying claim
takes
to
two
the
to
ocean, the
tango.
South China Sea, man. I mean,
what's the
stop,
source of instability in the Taiwan Strait? It's you, not us.
Stop ramming and sinking, Philippine vessels or Vietnamese vessels. Or, stop, these maneuvers against our forces. Stop painting our pilots with lasers. How about stop bludgeoning Indian soldiers on the Himalayan frontier? That might create a better environment. I mean,
for sure.
So I think, you got to call these guys out on it.
Yeah.
I think when they talk that doublespeak and really what Xi Jinping wants is he wants President Trump to cede that part of the world to him.
Yes.
And so the words that he wants President Trump to say, these are the words they try to get Americans to say: win-win, right? It's a win-win for us. Well, what win-win is? It means China wins twice. That's what that means. Then the G2. President Trump said this. He said this recently. It was kind of like we could have kind of a G2. What that means is China and the U.S. divide the world up.
Yeah.
Well, as soon as you say that, China goes around Southeast Asia, bludgeons all those countries over the head, and say, hey,
you can't
President
rely
Trump
on the
just
Americans bandwagon with us.
Bandwagon with us.
Exactly.
They want you to say a new kind of great power relationship.
Yes.
Which means the U.S. is ceding influence to China, really showing China that we defer to them in their area. The theatrics around, the images around President Trump's visit, if he goes in April, are all going to be about trying to portray President Trump as supplicating to the emperor, right?
Kowtowing.
Yeah, I mean that's what they do with all foreign leaders. President Trump, I think, won't fall into that trap or contribute to that. But I wrote about this pretty extensively about the trip in 2017 and the theater and imagery around the visit to the Forbidden City, and how this was meant to portray to the world and to the Chinese people that Xi Jinping was all powerful. Yeah. And President Trump was coming to be in awe of China and China's effort, frankly, to reestablish the tributary system of the Qing dynasty. That's how he sees what he wants to achieve internationally.
Yeah, and the last couple centuries have been the anomaly for China in their minds, and they want to get back to this Middle Kingdom.
Well, and hey, what they do is, the old saying that he who controls the past is Orwell. He who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future, or something to that effect. Yeah. China has a deliberate effort to manipulate our memory. Yeah. With the century of humiliation, that's all the problem.
Exactly.
Well, how about Mao killing more of his own people than Hitler and Stalin combined? Maybe that has something to do with the problems that you had. Right. With the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and so, there's this narrative that look at how the Chinese Communist Party has lifted the Chinese people up, but I'm very persuaded by the fantastic scholar Frank Decoder, who's written now I think it's the 6th volume of a comprehensive history of of the Chinese Communist Party.
Wow.
The most recent one is about the Civil War, and the one before this was China. China after Mao, bookended. There's one on Mao's Great Famine, which I would recommend reading that first. That was the first. Anyway, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
But his point, the point that comes out from his books, is that Chinese Communist Party doesn't get credit for that. The Chinese people get credit for that.
Right.
And in many ways, the Chinese people succeeded despite the party.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
and so I think what you're seeing now, as I mentioned at the top, is that the Chinese Communist Party has created real vulnerabilities in their economy, right? By this doubling down in the last plenum, the fourth plenum in last November, they doubled down on industrial production and exports. It's the only part of the economy that's working, but they're running out of runway on that. The consumer economy is kind of, in the doldrums. You have the real estate crisis, the debt crisis, and foreign investment is drying up. Thank goodness. I mean, anybody who invests in Chinese companies is really investing in the Chinese Communist Party and is indirectly, in my view, supporting their technologically enabled Orwellian police state, as well as the cultural genocide of the Uyghurs, the suppression of the Tibetans. And look what they just did with Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai,
yes.
78-year-old man.
Who did an event here at FDD.
A fantastic human being.
Yes.
And they just sentenced a 78-year-old man.
Which is a death sentence,
to
as
20
Craig
years.
Singleton has pointed out.
20 years,
Yeah, no, I admire the desire to do deals, and deals can be wonderful or they can be horrible. But I as someone who barely ran a lemonade stand as a kid, I don't pretend to be an expert on business, but, I've kind of looked at national security stuff for a little while. And as a general axiom, and eager to hear whether you agree or not, is that sometimes no deal is better than a bad deal. And the kind of a reflexive desire to get a deal, if the person you're negotiating with believes that you'll give up almost anything to get a deal, then it seems like you go into the bargaining table at a disadvantage. Is that too simplistic?
No, it's not too simplistic. And then also this kind of tendency on our part to make concessions up front. Right. Now, I do not believe for a minute that President Trump will sign up for a bad deal. He'll walk out of it at the end. But I think there will be efforts to make some concessions. But what will happen is the Chinese will demand more. When you make a concession to the Chinese, or to the Iranians for that matter, you know what they do? They pocket it.
Yes.
And then they remain intransigent on their main points. And this is what happened that produced what President Trump used to call the worst deal ever, right? The Iran nuclear deal in 2015.
Yeah.
And there's this myth, oh my gosh, the Iranians, they're such good negotiators. No, we're just terrible negotiators. And so what the Iranians do is they just, they'll say, oh yeah, we'll do that, but then they'll pull it back like next week. Okay, no, we're not going to do that. Well, then we'll make a concession on that. And they just wait you out because we think a deal is an end in of itself, is what you're alluding to.
Yes.
And so we make concession after concession. We get a weak deal that cuts against our interests. We declare a diplomatic victory, but it's actually a political defeat.
Right.
Or an economic defeat.
Exactly.
So, let's not do that. What I'm afraid of, and this is, I'm not afraid of it. I don't think it's going to happen. But there's a danger that if we make concessions to China, we will do for Xi Jinping in 2026 what President Obama did for Ayatollah Khamenei in 2015 and pull him up off the mat. Because I think he's on the mat right now, and so let's not do that.
Yeah. The national security strategy, I said there was a reluctance to name adversaries by name, look them in the face and call them out for what they are. And then the national defense strategy, it didn't even mention Taiwan once. Yeah. And Mark Montgomery has on a high authority that an unnamed cabinet official may have edited that out there because we didn't want to provoke. And that does remind me of what we saw during the Biden administration, where we didn't want to provoke Putin by providing Ukraine the means of self-defense. So we had these delaying and slow rolling of weapon systems.
And we pulled out. We ended the missile defense program for Poland.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And so just what you foot stomping what you said earlier is that we think we're being good guys and gals. We're being so reasonable. We're making concessions, but time and time again, our autocratic adversaries see that concession as weakness to be
Yes.
exploited. And we
Absolutely.
keep repeating the same mistake. And in our remaining moments, I want to pivot, if I may, to Iran. You've mentioned Khamenei, the Supreme Leader Khamenei, a couple times. Let's pray that he's the last Supreme Leader there in Iran. I've asserted that sometimes no deal is better than a bad deal. As we were talking about China, I was thinking about Iran as well. The president deserves great credit for what he did during the 12-day war.
And putting back into place economic pressure.
Absolutely. A lot of positive steps with respect to Iran. But he encouraged the protesters to come out, right, and encouraged them to come out. And then the Supreme Leader and his goons have then murdered thousands of them. Do you worry about how that will look both to the Iranian people and more broadly if we encourage protesters to come out and then they get murdered by the thousands and we don't impose some sort of consequences for that?
Yeah, I mean, it was heartbreaking. I mean, I'm telling you, I mean, there has to be more outrage about this, about the mass murder, Iranians' mass murder of their own citizens. Yeah. I mean, I think that I'm confident in the number of 30,000 in a 2-day period. Yeah. January 8th or 9th or 7th or 8th. And so what I don't understand is why there's any Iranian embassy remaining open in the world. I mean, they should all be kicked out. You know, any consulate, kick them out. I mean, they really should understand that that the world is not going to stand for this. You know, or at least across the free world. In terms of encouraging it and then not doing it, I think this probably has a lot to do with practical concerns associated with having enough assets there, not just to attack, to attack Iran, but to defend against Iran's response. Iran has been scrambling, as FDD's reported on, to reconstitute its missile capabilities. And it is husbanding as many ballistic missiles as it can, which it will probably fire against, Israel and maybe their Arab neighbors and so forth. Yeah. So I think what you see now with what President Trump has described as the Armada, and then the air squadrons deploying there would increase the defensive capability, as well as kind of a strike package that could go after, a broad range of targets that we probably shouldn't talk about. But anyway, I think, I mean, I think what the president does, and he's done this, multiple times now, is he'll try to get a deal. He loves deals, right? Yeah. And he tried with the Iranians in 2017 when I was National Security Advisor. I said, hey, Mr. President, I mean, this is going to work, I mean, but the pattern has been to give Maduro a chance, right? Yeah. He sent Ambassador Grinnell down there to try to make a deal with Maduro, and then he acted. He did the same thing before Operation Midnight Hammer. When he gave the Iranians 60 days, remember? And then the foreign minister met with Europeans and was recalcitrant and so forth, and our negotiations weren't getting anywhere. So he struck. So I hope that he finally runs the course on that with Russia. I'm like waiting for that to happen. Yeah. But I think ultimately the same will happen with Xi Jinping. The same happened with Kim Jong-un too in Trump 1 in 2018. With the two summits in Singapore and Hanoi, Kim Jong-un made unreasonable demands in Hanoi. President Trump got up and walked out. So yes. So
the ability to walk away if it serves our interests, and I don't know. It seems to me that a deal worth signing with the Iranians would include an end to its nuclear program, an end for support for terrorism. Addressing its ballistic missile program, the means by which they would deliver a nuclear weapon and they try to murder Arabs, Americans, and Israelis, and an end to the oppression of the Iranian people. And I think there's a snowball's chance in where in them ever to agree to that, because they'd have to be someone they are not to agree to that. And it seemed, I watched the last Iran deal from the perspective when I was working in the U.S. Senate, and it seems like Americans consistently get duped at the negotiating table with Iran, and we have to go in with our eyes wide open, or it'll happen again.
Absolutely, and they play us because we have people who are too clever by half, or we have people who are maybe unwitting, assets of the Iranians. And one of the arguments you would often hear people make that the Iranians propagate actually is that, hey, we're really divided in this government, this Iranian government, between Republicans and revolutionaries, Right. And if you just make these concessions. It'll strengthen the Republicans. And hey, man, the revolutionaries are in charge. You know, and they have a tight grip on that power. Now, are there people in the regime who are charlatans who don't really buy into the ideology of the revolution because that's the way they're getting ahead? That's the way they're surviving. Of course. But there are some people really diehard. I mean, you know, I mean, to quote Dr. Evil, man, you know, they're not the Diet Coke of Islamism. they're the real Coke of the philanthropy. And so they know that if they lose power, the Iranian people will probably not be kind to them after what they just did, especially murdering 30,000 of them, right? So you know, they're not going to fire themselves, Brad. You know?
Right, exactly. Well, General McMaster, thank you. I wish we had another hour. I could go on forever, all day, talking with you about these things. I learned so much sincerely from you. Such a mentor, such a friend. Thank you for being the chair of our Center on Military and Political Power, and just the incredible service to our country, both in uniform and in the White House, and all that you're continuing to do. So thank you so much for spending some time talking.
Well, I'll tell you, Brad, there are a lot of organizations that do what was one critic one called globaloney and Washington speak, you know. I mean, FDD doesn't do that. I mean, it's clear analysis. It's really, you know, clear recommendations that you can implement into policy. It's a real privilege to be here. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And thanks to our listeners for joining us here on another edition of Foreign Policy.